Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on which part of the country you're joining us from. My name is Roshni Melia, and I'm a program consultant with Media Impact Funders. For those of you that are new to our community, Media Impact Funders is a philanthropic serving organization that provides learning and networking opportunities to funders and grant makers who support media in the public interest. And for those of you who know us or are already part of our network, we're glad you're here. I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our first member briefing of 2024. In case you haven't heard of this member benefit, all members and supporters of Media Impact Funders have the opportunity to initiate and produce issue-related programming for their peers. These hour-long online briefings are meant to provide more time to learn from one another to maximize the impact of your work. If you're interested in learning more about these briefings or how you can organize one yourself, I'll drop a link in the chat. I want to thank the Institute for Nonprofit News for their leadership in being our producing partner, and the Inasmuch Foundation, the Joyce Foundation, and the Pivot Fund for sponsoring this very important session. In today's briefing, INN will share key findings from its latest DEI Index Report, which explores whether and how DEI is reflected in the nonprofit news sector's staffing, leadership, operations, engagement with underserved communities, and revenue patterns. This information is incredibly important to our members, to funders who support newsrooms and outlets, because it helps them understand the landscape, the gaps, and where support is needed to advance DEI efforts. And now I'm going to hand it over to Momita Chakraborty, Director of Institutional Giving at INN, and my partner in crime in producing this session. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Roshni. I really appreciate it. Before we get started, I also really want to say we're so pleased to be here to share some of our findings on the state of DIV in nonprofit news. INN is a great partner in crime, as Roshni mentioned, of MIF and a lot of our funder partners here. I'd also really just like to reiterate our thanks for our sponsors for this event, the Joyce Foundation, the Pivot Fund, and Inasmuch Foundation, for their thought leadership in moving the field forward more equitably and for their support for this event. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick level set and just set the purpose for this event. DEIB is nuanced and it's non-linear and it's never a finite process. So in opening this conversation, we want to recognize the imperfection of some of the concepts that we might be introducing and talking about while welcoming new ways of defining our values together. INN has a lot of data, but we're looking to be a resource to help feed into and complement a much larger effort amongst news outlets, researchers, funders, and others to illuminate, discuss, innovate, and also challenge the ways that we think about DEIB, how it is currently or how it could better be reflected in the news industry. We're also recognizing that we're all working in service of broader goals of racial, gender, and social justice. So we really do just want this to be an opening for a conversation throughout the year, and especially here today for this hour that we have together. For any kinds of questions or experiences or feedback that you might have, we want this to be a learning experience for everyone. For anyone rather, who isn't familiar with INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News, that's us, we seek to ensure that all people in every community have access to trusted news. We steward the core infrastructure for nonprofit news in the US, primarily via the INN network. We currently have over 430 members who are united by the INN standards around transparency, editorial excellence, and just other kinds of excellence. We are going beyond replacing news where legacy commercial media has been lost. We really are trying to move beyond the crisis in local journalism or local news or just journalism writ large to what we can do better together. So we're redefining journalism as a public service. We also provide in-depth nonpartisan reporting in response to local information needs. And in so doing, we build community trust. We drive collaborative solutions that are also sustainable. At the moment, INN members produce more than 20,000 unique stories a month. These are reshared and republished by more than 7,100 other outlets, both for and nonprofit. And so that means it's just reweaving the overall media ecosystem. And so we're really, really happy to be here today with some of our news leaders and some of our partners. And so with that, I will pass it over to Susanna Delphine.
Thank you, Mumita. Hello, everyone. My name is Susanna Delaplane, and I am an independent research and evaluation consultant, and I served as the lead researcher and writer for INN's recent in-depth study of DEI in the nonprofit news sector. And I'm just so happy to have this opportunity to share some of our findings, which I think will really nicely tee up the conversation that Alicia Bell will be facilitating with you all today. Can you go to the next? Perfect. Thank you. So I just wanted to start by sharing a little bit about our methods and approach. So this research was conducted as part of INN's latest index, which is an annual survey that gathers comprehensive data from INN's growing network of members to provide updates on sector trends and opportunities and challenges. The report captures the state of the sector in calendar year 2022. And it includes a total of 348 outlets, which is about 90% of INN's membership at the time. And then we also conducted interviews with 16 INN members to help us more deeply contextualize and interpret patterns in the survey data. And then, of course, our research questions, the survey instrument, and our analysis all benefited enormously from the input and feedback from an advisory board of researchers, INN members, and partner organizations. Next slide. So the report focused on three key questions. The first is the demographic composition of newsroom, both staff and leadership, and looking at any changes over the past few years. Second, we explored the specific practices that newsrooms undertake to advance DEI. And then third, we conducted analysis of funding patterns. So we were exploring potential differences between outlets led by people of color and serving communities of color compared to other outlets. And today I'm going to be focusing on the second two questions, but if you'd like to learn more, we really encourage you to check out the full report, which is posted on INN's website. And also, I think a link will be posted in the Zoom chat. So I'm going to start by talking about our findings on DEI practices. Going to the next slide, perfect. So we explored a range of practices, both those focused on internal operations and ways of working, and also practices focused on listening to communities and assessing their representation and coverage. And we don't have time to go through them all today, as much as I'd love to, but I wanted to mention that a key goal of ours was to explore not just what members do, but also how they do it and with what impact. And an important thing to keep in mind here is that INN members vary widely in terms of their respective histories and missions and ways of working. And we were mindful that calls for DEI in the news industry are primarily aimed at changing historically white-dominated newsrooms, interrogating how power structures that privilege whiteness and maleness are embedded in their practices, procedures, policies, and culture. And so for that reason, we broke out our findings for white-led outlets, which comprise about 70% of INN's membership. But at the same time, it's really important to reflect the work that organizations led by people of color are doing in this space. So their interview and their survey responses really indicate that many are exploring how they can further advance DEI, both in their own internal operations and culture, but also in terms of sharing their practices and serving as thought leaders and advisors to others in the sector. So we really wanted to recognize that this work is taking place by exploring the practices of BIPOC-led outlets, which comprise about 18% of INN's membership. So I'm going to start with just the headline here for DEI practices, which is that many of the practices we asked about, particularly around the planning and investment in DEI and operational changes, are not widespread. So as you can see in this chart here, this focuses on steps that outlets can take to first define and create plans for specific DEI goals, and then to invest in measuring and reporting on progress towards those goals. And you can see that many nonprofit newsrooms have not yet undertaken these steps. And one pattern that we thought was really interesting here that you can see is that outlets were more likely to have defined goals around diversity than they were goals for equity or inclusion, which we asked about separately here. And there was a particularly large gap for this among white-led outlets, whereas BIPOC-led outlets were relatively more likely to have established equity and inclusion goals in addition to diversity goals. And then we also observed that organization size plays a role here. So the larger the organization, the more likely it was to have engaged in each of these practices. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, that one. Yes, perfect. So this second chart is showing a similar pattern for efforts that can impact newsroom operations and ways of working. So overall, a minority of INN members have engaged in each of these efforts, but the pattern, oh, go back, thank you. The pattern does vary across different groups of outlets. So for example, you can see here that BIPOC-led outlets were more than twice as likely as white-led outlets to have made structural changes that strengthen the formal decision-making authority of staff of color or other underrepresented groups in how the newsroom operates. And again, we saw that size plays a role. So larger outlets were more likely to engage in each of these practices than smaller outlets. Next slide. So beyond these numbers, we heard qualitatively that really how DEI practices are implemented isn't as important as what is implemented. So interviewees flagged for us questions that they're really wrestling with as they seek to integrate equity and inclusion into their policies and systems. So these questions include things like how to structure employee benefits, how to structure the pay scale to value different forms of expertise, how to ensure transparency and equity in hiring and advancement processes, and to help them really rethink their operations through this lens of equity and inclusion. Some INN members really expressed a desire for more concrete examples of how they can operationalize practices, as well as technical assistance to help them create equitable and inclusive policies and culture. Next slide. So there's a couple takeaways that might be especially relevant for funders to consider here. First, the findings underscore that it's important to go beyond check the box DEI. So meaningfully integrating DEI into internal systems and policies and culture requires space to rethink, business as usual, and wrestle with those challenging questions and try out new ways of operating. And funders can support these efforts by helping outlets, and particularly the smaller outlets, dedicate the resources and staff they need to sustain these efforts and to evaluate these efforts, and increasing access to technical assistance that helps them navigate organizational change. These findings also underscore that DEI is, of course, not one size fits all. So because nonprofit news outlets do vary in size and history and mission and audience, they will vary in how they reflect the many different dimensions of DEI and where they see room to strengthen their efforts. So a nuanced approach is really helpful in how funders evaluate and fund the DEI goals and practices of different newsrooms. Next slide. Okay, so turning to our findings on funding, here our analysis was informed by growing attention to equity in funding within the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, including recent research that has documented disparities between BIPOC-led and white-led organizations. So when we looked at foundation funding reported by INN members in 2022, what we found is actually that there's no single sort of tidy headline. Rather, the findings are very nuanced and complex. So what you're seeing here is a graph that pools across INN members. And what it shows is that the total amount of foundation funding going to white-led outlets is roughly proportional to the respective prevalence in INN membership. And since there's more than 3 times as many white-led outlets than BIPOC-led outlets in INN's network, that means that the majority of foundation funding, or about 63%, went to white-led outlets, right? Next slide. So when we probed the data a little bit further, what we found was that BIPOC-led outlets reported a higher median amount of foundation funding than white-led outlets. And when we looked at this some more to sort of break down what we're seeing here, the data suggested that two factors can help us better understand and nuance this pattern. So the first one is geographic scope, which you see represented here in the chart. State and local BIPOC-led outlets reported a higher median amount of foundation funding than white-led outlets, okay? But the pattern is reversed when you look at those national outlets, right? And then the second factor is whether an outlet is a startup. So startup is defined by INN as an outlet launched in the past 3 years. And what we saw was that BIPOC-led startups report a higher median amount of foundation funding than white-led startups, and that's particularly pronounced at that state and local level. Meanwhile, more established BIPOC-led outlets that have been around for a longer period of time tend to report lower levels of foundation funding than their startup counterparts. And among those national outlets, again, those established BIPOC-led outlets lagged far behind the white-led outlets in foundation funding. So there's this interaction we're seeing between geographic scope and whether you're a startup or not. So here we're emphasizing that it's important to put these findings into historical context. The newsrooms really emphasized that any shift, the ones that we interviewed emphasized that any shift towards more funding of BIPOC-led outlets is a relatively recent development, traced in large part to funders' increased focus on DEI since 2020. And they also questioned whether the increased philanthropic focus on DEI and that corresponding support for BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations is proportional to the systemic harm and inequities experienced by people of color across hundreds of years in the US. And so as what we heard from multiple interviewees is that even if we're seeing some shifts here, it's just not enough. Next slide. And moreover, in the current context, BIPOC-led outlets describe to us how some funder practices continue to perpetuate inequities, citing recent experiences with racial bias in funders' decisions about whether and how much and under what terms they're willing to fund BIPOC-led outlets versus white-led outlets. And we actually saw this manifest in our survey data in terms of who got general operating support from foundations as opposed to more restricted or project-specific grants. So white-led outlets reported a higher percentage of their foundation funding was unrestricted compared to BIPOC-led outlets. And as several interviewees pointed out to us, funder resistance to providing general operating support significantly hinders their organizational growth and ability to sustain their work. Last slide. Perfect. So just a couple of key takeaways that might be relevant for funders to consider. Yes, we observed some preliminary signs of increased support for BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving outlets, and these do speak to philanthropic efforts to address funding inequities. But it's important to continue tracking this over time to understand if it's actually a sustained trend or more of an anomaly. And in doing that, we should be mindful that funding patterns among INN members may not always generalize to the full population of BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving outlets in the US, many of whom are not INN members. So just to keep that context in perspective. And then lastly, the findings really underscore that a strong equity lens is needed to sustain and expand upon these efforts. So that would include recognizing how historical and current power imbalances continue to impact access to funding that outlets need to support their organizational growth and sustainability over the long term. So with that, I'll turn it back to Momita.
Thank you. So I just want to reiterate a few things. So the INN Index is currently the most comprehensive study of the state of nonprofit news. As Susanna mentioned, it does only survey INN members, and I will link to our INN standards in the chat in just a minute. So as the nonprofit news field rapidly changes and grows, the INN Index is really a proper kind of like pulse on tracking and studying what's happening behind the scenes as well, what it looks like on the surface and what it actually takes. And the DEI Index really kind of delves into the second part of that. So through exploring index data, we and a lot of our stakeholders, funders, partners, newsrooms, They all learn how to kind of like drive nonprofit news and just journalism, frankly, forwards, how it's funded, who it serves, who it can serve, and how we can continue expanding sources of high quality and trusted news and information for the public. As again, Susanna mentioned, this is INA's second DEI deep dive. The first captured the state of the sector in 2019. It was published in 2020. And a lot has happened since then, including a national racial reckoning, which had reverberations through philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, not just news, as well as the global pandemic, which of course had serious implications for the communities that we all serve, as well as policy and public infrastructure. So at the same time, we've also seen an increase in INN members, particularly among startups, digital, local, and outlets serving underrepresented communities. So that includes rural, BIPOC, and non-English speaking communities, and outlets serving them and based there. It's important to note too that many of them started out of a deep community need, and so they're not necessarily journalists. And so just to kind of recap, and before I pass it over to our panelists here, a few pillars that have kind of emerged from Susanna's work and from our DEI index this year is around diversity. So not only the racial, ethnic, and gender composition of nonprofit news staff, their leadership and their boards, which are questions that I'm sure that we're all very familiar with having asked and asking, but also our DEI practices. What are some of the trajectories that our news organizations are using or want to be using to advance DEIB? And I want to also emphasize the B part of this. Both in how they operate and how they serve the information needs of their immediate communities and the communities that they're aiming to serve. And of course, there is the funding aspect too. So are there disparities in the level of foundation funding? How can we diversify our funding as news organizations and so on? Before I get started with our panelists, we do have our first question, and this is actually for you, Susanna. How we're defining white-led organizations. Is it by percentage of leadership and board or staff or some other kind of description?
Sure, thank you for the question. Yeah, so for both BIPOC-led and white-led, so BIPOC, just to back up, was a category that we did not ask about. It is a extrapolated category based on a longer list of racial and ethnic categories that the newsrooms were asked to report against. So they reported the number of individuals in their organization that identified with any of these different racial categories, and then any category that was not white was summed into the BIPOC category. So if any of their individual staff or leadership or board members identified with something other than white, they were included in the BIPOC category. So it's a fairly inclusive category. So that's BIPOC. And then in terms of leadership, we focused our definition for white-led and BIPOC-led on executives and managers. So if an organization's executives and managers were more than 50% white, then it was considered a white-led organization. And it was more than 50% BIPOC, then it was a BIPOC-led organization. And the report goes into a little bit more detail around these decisions and the different ways in which you can measure in different ways you can measure BIPOC-led, and also the distinction between BIPOC-led and BIPOC serving, which we treated as different in the report. That was a long answer, sorry. Hopefully it was helpful.
Yeah, I think that was really illuminative. And please keep the questions coming in the chat or send it over directly to Roshni or myself. We are going to open up the discussion part of this webinar now, and it is going to be interactive, but I would really like to welcome our panelists today. So we have Alicia Bell, the Director of the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund at Borealis Philanthropy. We have Vandana Kumar, the publisher and CEO of India Currents, and Seamus Toomey, the publisher and co-founder of Block Club Chicago. So welcome all, and I will give the floor to you, Alicia.
Thanks so much, Mamita, and thank you all for having us here today. My name is Alicia Bell, as Mamita mentioned, and I am the proud director of the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. The Racial Equity and Journalism Fund is a part of this movement, like so many of you, towards a holistic, accurate journalism that contributes to a thriving, healthy, multiracial democracy. And what we know is that in order for that to exist, we have to have a well-resourced, thriving BIPOC journalism ecosystem. And so to that end, we facilitate and coordinate a community of practice amongst donors and funders who are interested in that future and who are interested in supporting that ecosystem. And with our donor partners, we pool the resources and facilitate grant making to BIPOC-led and serving news organizations across the United States. We are one of the only funds to exclusively fund BIPOC-led and serving news organizations at a national level and a translocal level. With those practitioners and with those newsrooms, we also facilitate a community of practice, and through that community of practice, facilitate technical assistance, capacity building, and also relationship building and opportunities for play and respite. And then in collaboration with our donor partners and in collaboration with our practitioner partners, we maintain one of the largest repositories for knowledge and information on the BIPOC journalism ecosystem in the United States. And so when I come here today, I come to you on behalf of my team, Dalia, Jessica, Kiana, Alexa, Brittany, Manami, and I come to you on behalf of all of the newsrooms that we work with and on behalf of all of the donors and funder partners who are part of that community of practice. And so I'm going to pass it to Vandana to introduce herself, and then we'll pass it to Seamus afterwards.
Thank you, Alicia. Hi, everyone. My name is Vandana Kumar, and I serve as publisher of India Currents magazine. We started India Currents in 1987. I was one of the founders. I'm the only founder that's still here 35 years later. But it started as a labor of love. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that. The fact that there was a growing Indian American community, the fact that there was no place where they could celebrate. We serve Indian American immigrants, and I think it's really important to also focus on that. Immigrants who are first-generation immigrants who have come from another country are looking or were looking for a place where they could meet others like them. I was one of them. That's why I call it a labor of love, And remember, this was the pre-internet era, we couldn't just Google anything. So we started out printing a print magazine. And we've been credited for actually helping build a community. Every month, people gathered around the pages of India Currents, sharing experiences, sharing resources. It was a celebration of sorts, every month that people looked forward to. Our revenue model was advertising. Now, at our peak, we were printing, mailing, and distributing 30,000 copies every month directly to end users at no cost to them. We were very cognizant of the fact that these were immigrants, they were fresh immigrants, they perhaps could not afford to do that. But with the arrival of the social media, the internet. I think all of the folks that have worked in the media landscape, you know that that whole model got upended. And then there was a big, even among our organization, you know, we were trying to figure out, is there still a need for an organization like India Currents that serves Indian immigrants? Or have we really arrived at this post-racial moment in time where we don't need something of our own? But I think the pandemic really gave that answer clearly to us. The fact that we are considered a trusted media, the fact that, you know, people still turn to us for information, we became really mission-driven. The idea that our voices belong in any national dialogue on any issue, but we belong there. And we have made a switch to building another revenue model, but it's our mission that drives us. And I'm hoping, Alicia, that we'll have more time to talk about other details, but I think it's an introduction for those of you who are unfamiliar with India Currents. We are also the first nonprofit award-winning magazine that serves the Indian American community, which is the second largest immigrant community in Santa Clara County, where we are based. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Seamus Toomey. I'm the publisher and one of the three co-founders of Block Club Chicago. We are a local news organization, a proud INN member. We started almost 6 years ago after a previous news organization we worked for called DEI Info was unceremoniously shut down by the single owner that we had. We decided at that moment that we were still serving an important purpose in Chicago, which was covering the neighborhoods of Chicago, which we were seeing less and less of happening with the legacy media. They were, when they looked to cut, they were cutting the local reporters first, and they were really leaving a lot of great stories throughout Chicago uncovered, particularly in underserved neighborhoods that had historically been overlooked. So we really saw a hole to fill, and we decided that we could try starting this on our own as a nonprofit, reader supported. And we started with just three of us with an idea in a couple coffee shops. We went to Kickstarter, and we really sort of proved out our idea when we got quite a bit of support from Kickstarter for our initial beginning, to the tune of about $183,000 to get us off the ground. We've grown to over 30 staffers right now, most of them neighborhood reporters. And really just our goal is to place general assignment reporters throughout Chicago in all neighborhoods and have them be the experts in their neighborhood and cover the whole gamut, everything, small, medium, large, and really treat each neighborhood as it's equally throughout Chicago. That's really our goal, is to show Chicago, all aspects of it, as fairly and equitably as possible, so people can learn about Chicago, learn about their own neighborhoods, and not really reflect the narrative that is often spread about Chicago by outsiders. We want real Chicagoans to see what we're really about. So thank you.
Thanks, Shel, for that. And I want to remind folks in the room, you know, I have a few questions that I want to ask Vandana and Seamus, and I promise I don't have any shortage of those. But if you think of questions or if you have comments, feel free to drop those in the chat, or you can share those directly to one of the hosts or raise your hand, so that we can make sure that we are able to weave those in. But for now, you know, Vandana and Seamus, I know both of you have spoken a little bit about those communities and specific communities that you serve, but I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about what your work means for those communities, and then at a broader level, if you could pan out and talk about why your work is necessary for a multiracial public and for a multiracial democracy.
I can start. What I hope our work means for the communities we cover is that they feel reflected in the coverage, that it's not us talking to them, it's we're reporting their stories. We try to hire reporters from the neighborhood where they're going to cover, or people with familiarity with it. We find the reporters that know the neighborhoods coming in are really often our best reporters because they know what's important to the people they're covering. They know when a restaurant shuts down that it's a big deal because their grandma used to go there and it was the central meeting spot and it had fallen on hard times, but we need to focus on this because it's an important part of the history. So to us, we want them to know that we're a part of the community, that they live there, they're walking the beat, meeting people. And part of it is we really want to write about everything. Really, the small stories I feel like are the ones that really start to build trust when they see something, they say, oh yeah, that person knows what she's talking about. That's, that is our neighborhood. That's important. Answering their questions, but really, making sure that we're treating each neighborhood fairly. A lot of other media in Chicago, they often will parachute into a neighborhood when something terrible happens. And then the news coverage tends to be about that neighborhood. It's always bad things. And when we know that's just part of what's happening in that neighborhood, there's great things happening there. There's artists living there. There's new business owners there. There's people developing community gardens, all that sort of thing. So we really want to report it and people see it as like, yes, that's how I see my neighborhood too. And instill a little bit more pride in their neighborhood when they get to share these stories outside the neighborhood. And and maybe educate people that have a preconceived notion about, oh, I only hear about that place on TV news about this thing. They read about it and they say, hey, I think we should go there. I think we got to check out that restaurant. We should check out that new theater or this art installation. So we're trying to, spread the pride of the neighborhoods that we have. We're really proud of Chicago. It's, it's our central tenet is that we love Chicago and we like to share all the news, good and bad. So that's what I hope it means to them, is that they're feeling like they're being represented by the reporters that live next door.
Seamus, as I was listening to you, I was feeling that in so many ways, we are doing exactly the same thing. We're just serving different markets. We are serving slightly different demographics, but so heartening to actually hear that from you. Alicia, I think the role that community media, ethnic media like India Currents plays is twofold. One is we are here to celebrate the community we serve. We also want to go beyond this model minority narrative that exists about the Indian American community. Success stories, the celebration of Silicon Valley successes, get a lot of ink. They're covered by all. But our community, just like any community, is made up of all kinds of people. People who are teachers, people who are nurses, people who are beauty queen aspirants, people, it's just everybody. And it's those stories that don't get told. And we've made a lot of effort over the years to showcase those stories as well, because they also belong. They also represent. Now, something that a lot of people are not aware is the first generation immigrants that we serve that have come to this country. and the kinds of folks that were allowed to come to this country is really a measure of the immigration policies of the United States. H-1Bs, H-1B visas were designed by Silicon Valley companies to get more workers to come here. So as a result, we have a lot of people like that that have actually immigrated to the United States. So yeah, that's a lot of folks. But I think just being focused and just imagining that the entire community is just that is hard to counter that. It's really hard to counter that. And so that's our effort. And I think it's really important. And I'll give you an example of why I say that I know that this is important. When the pandemic hit, lots of bad things happened, lot of shifts happen. It gave people a sense of realization of what's really important in their lives. I think across the globe, there was an analysis or a reckoning that populations came to because you realized what was important for you. And I just wanted to share this crazy thing that happened is we started getting. Now, let me tell you, till 2020, we would occasionally get a letter, we would occasionally get an email, unlike our early years when we used to get a lot. But during the pandemic, we started getting inundated by emails, by letters, by phone calls from our community. I was thinking, what the heck has happened? But, there was a common refrain. The fact that people said at a time of uncertainty in our lives, we turned to India Currents. We were new immigrants here. We didn't have resources. We didn't know who to turn to. You were our own. We turned to you. And at this moment in time, when we are again facing a time of uncertainty, we are turning to you again. I seek solace in the community that's around India Currents. And I cannot tell you what that meant for us as an organization, what that meant for me personally as well. It's yes, it is important. We have not arrived at that post-racial moment in time where all our stories are being told by the mainstream media. We are still telling stories in a way that the community we serve understands. And I think that's a huge role that we play. And that's why I think it's really important. Why do I think that community media is important? We can tell stories about any issue in the mainstream through a cultural lens that no one else offers. And I say that with great certainty.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like those are the things that y'all are sharing are things that I feel like I can vouch for and hear across all of the BIPOC-led organizations and the community media organizations that we work with. And I think about all the years that mis and disinformation have been buzzwords in journalism, and it'll probably pop up again because it's an election year, and that's a good year to talk about misinformation and disinformation. And the things that I hear y'all sharing, they fight mis and disinformation twofold. It's fighting that mis and disinfo at a community level internally by uplifting celebration, by uplifting holistic news, and then on the other side, it's fighting mis and disinformation by ensuring that external communities also have access to accurate information and holistic information about communities. I'm thinking about a month from now, the Night Media Forum will be happening in Miami, right? You're going to get an entirely different story about Black Miami if you are reading High-Low News, which is a Black-led news organization, then you're going to get from the Miami Herald, just by virtue of the work that they do as news organizations. You're going to get a really different, full understanding of the Muskogee Creek Nation by reading Muskogee media than you are by looking at kind of mainstream news in Oklahoma. So I think I hear that both as a celebration and a way of caring for folks, but also contributing to civic participation on so many levels and contributing to democracy on so many levels. And I'm curious about what it takes to make that kind of work happen. There are a few folks who have asked about y'all's organizational budgets. And so I'm curious if y'all would be willing to share those things. And then also to share what's possible if and as your work is abundantly and adequately resourced, and what gets lost in the meantime. Maybe Seamus, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, I'll kick it off. Good question. We our budget for the year that just ended, we had about $4 million, which just blows my mind considering where we started. We've gotten a lot of amazing support from our readers. We have about 20,000 subscribers who pay for Block Club to get full access to all of our newsletters. The vast majority of all of our stories are free. We do make some things for subscribers like newsletters and access to everything on the site, but it's mostly free to all. So that's a huge part of our revenue, and we're really proud of that because back to the point of the Kickstarter, like people came to us and said, we need this. We're willing to pay a little bit to support it because it went away for a while and we saw the hole that was left. So big part of it is from readers, and we also get great support from individual donors, from philanthropy, who hear our request to say, could you support us if we were to add reporters to these particular neighborhoods that could really benefit from a full-time reporter? Well, we've had a lot of success in asking specifically for areas of coverage. But in terms of just sustainability, it's like covering the news. You got to do it every single day. You just got to grind it out. There's no stopping. We've got to keep doing good stories that people want to read, that they want to share, they want to tell their friends about and say, did you read this in Block Club? They're different than other news organizations. They're out front of a lot of issues. They're breaking stories in neighborhoods that all the other media come and follow up on a lot of times, because we've got reporters on the ground there sniffing around for fun stories and things that reflect Chicago. So it has been fantastic, but we know I feel like sometimes we're only as good as our morning newsletter that day, and we just got to keep trying to write stories about Chicago that show Chicago, that inform people, that tell them something they don't know about their neighborhood, or something they knew about their neighborhood but they want other people to know also. So we just sort of just grind it out every day, and that's for all of us on this call that are in the news, that is a fun part of it. What's happening out there today? Let's go tell some people about it.
Mandana?
Yeah, that is so true. If we did not love what we were doing, we would not be doing it. I think that's a given. Alicia, our story and trajectory is perhaps a little bit different. I told you we started in 1987, Labor of Love. But we printed a magazine for 32 years, all of which was covered through advertising revenue. We never asked our readers for any support. And we never had any philanthropic support either at that point. But in 2019, when we became intentional about being mission-driven, what is our mission? Our mission is to help, first of all, to celebrate the community we serve. The second thing is to help build storytellers of color. We actively work on that. Most of the stories that are told through the India Currents are told by many times first-time community journalists who may or may not have actual training. Today, we are fortunate. We have actually trained people on staff, but we haven't really had that. It's always been bootstrapped. I think even now, our most recent year that just closed has been a blockbuster year for us, where we had a budget of a little over $350,000. We are still able to do kick-ass work. We are still churning out stories every day. We are still producing award-winning work. Every year after year. It's not that, hey, just last year we won. In our history, you can go back and we've been winning awards for dozens of years. So I know that what we do is quality work. We have very little resources, but the fact that drives our team is the fact that we really care that our voices are part of this national dialogue on anything, of the local conversations that are having on any issues, whether we are talking about the census local that's happening in Santa Clara County, whether we are talking about redistricting that was happening in our neighborhood, whether it's talking about participating in elections. And remember, immigrants often come with a mindset from their home countries where there is a great distrust of government and the feeling like our voices don't really matter. Why should we vote? Why should we do? We don't tell people how to vote. We just tell them to vote. And I think, the News Revenue Hub recently did a survey for us. And since we became intentional really about this, it's just been a few years, 2-3 years. 20% of our respondents said they voted because of the Journalism in India currents. I cannot tell you what that number meant for us. Now, granted, it's still a small number, but we've just started on that process. And that gives us all, the excitement, the energy. It's like, yes, it matters. It matters. And most of our team members are women, simply because women are willing to work on issues. They often have breadwinners at home that are responsible for their, family's expenses, just like everybody else. So they're willing to say that, hey, I'm willing to actually work on this because this work really matters to me. And it's only, I think, this year that we've added another male reporter on our staff. So, but the bulk of our team, they're all women.
Yeah. And there was a report that came out recently, and I'll see if I can find it to drop it in here, that talks about with the vast kind of underinvestment in women in philanthropy broadly, specifically girls and women of color, how much folks make possible. And I think a lot of times that's looked at as a celebration, and it is cause for celebration, but it's also, it's not sustainable, and it's not fair, and it's not kind. And so I also, like, when I hear that, I'm like, and like, I want folks to know that just because y'all have been able to do so much more is not an excuse to expect you to only be able to do that with little bits of resources.
Yeah, and Alicia, it's also exhausting, right?
Yeah.
You are doing this work, because let's agree that this work is hard. It's day in and day out. We're asking more and more of our reporters and editors. And so we have a constant turnover because people get burnt out, And for a small organization like ours, oh my gosh, now I have to advertise again. Now I have to find someone again. I have to retrain them again. And last year we went through like 8, in a small team, 8 times we had this turnover. It just is not productive. I wish we had adequate support where we could, hire full-time people, give them benefits. So this would actually be a career versus a stopgap.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think to Susanna's point earlier, and some of the things that come up in the INN research about kind of the shift and change of philanthropy, especially in regards to BIPOC-led and serving news organizations. I think about putting that information and that data in conversation with the foundation maps for media funding that MIF is a partner with. And those foundation maps, they show that from 2013 to 2017, it was 7.4% of philanthropic dollars that were going to BIPOC-led and serving organizations. And then when you put that in conversation with the NORC research that was also released this past year in collaboration with MIF, that data shows that 70% of funders did have an increase in funding for BIPOC-led and serving journalism, and that from 2018 to 22, that number was still 11.4%. So 11.4% of philanthropic dollars from 2018 to 2022 were going to BIPOC-led and serving news organizations. So I think when we think about all of this different research and conversation with each other, and these stories that y'all are sharing, it paints a more holistic picture that's really important for us to kind of root ourselves and ground ourselves in. I know we're wrapping up, and so I'm gonna ask Seamus and Vandana just to share kind of your one sentence, like folks had some questions about what you're facing in terms of philanthropic funding, and so I just wanted y'all to share, like, what is the one question that you hope you never have to answer again? And then what is the one question that you never get asked, but you would love to answer in terms of philanthropy? And then I know there was a question that folks had about the Reg work, but I'll drop my email in here, and I think several of us will, so if folks want to be in contact afterwards, we can. But yes, Vandana and Seamus, what is the one question you hope to never answer again? And what is the one question you don't get asked, but that you would love to answer?
Oh, maybe there were a lot of questions that you raised, Alicia, but one question that I hope never to answer. One is, what are you doing about diversity? To keep explaining the diversity that exists in my organization and what we're doing. I don't want to answer that, and what I wish they would ask is actually to understand what I actually want people to offer is multi-year grants. But above all, Alicia, I think the biggest thing that I have is give us a chance. I don't have access to philanthropic. And I celebrate Seamus, the fact that they're able to raise that money, whether that's through Kickstarter or through whatever else. Kudos to you, man. I have a lot to learn from you because I don't have access. People don't respond. When I write to them, nobody responds to my email. I have to count on mentors to help make those introductions. I don't have, so I would love to be given that opportunity. And I would love the opportunity for multi-year grants because, 1 year we might get a grant, but next year is a huge struggle again. But there's over to you, Seamus.
Thank you. I would say the one thing that I don't want to be asked, it would be what specific project can we fund to help you? I think I speak for a lot of news organizations where we generally say we just need help in general. We need back office support. We need accountants. We need lawyers. We need to pay our reporters in a way that's fair. So sometimes, while we love tackling some project funding is great because it really can get a specific focus and get things done. I saw in a lot of the the index results, so just about Gen Ops funding and about how there's a various degrees of funding depending on who leads the organization. I would say that's an important thing for funders to know, is that general operating and letting the news organization sort of decide how best to distribute the money, because they know their priorities better than most. And sometimes organizations may start, creating projects that weren't part of their mission just to secure the funding, when what they really could use would be another editor on the desk. So, you could take a vacation sometime, or you could not be up till midnight editing stories. So that would be a variation of your question about what I don't like to be asked and what I would ask. But it's important, I think. We think a lot about it, but what if we had a little extra money, how we would spend it to be better, to have the reporters not burn out, to your point, to give them breaks and have someone fill in for them when big news happens, to say, hey, listen, you've had a tough week, take Friday off. We can get somebody to cover that for you. So that goes a long way, just to sort of, just keep people fresh and not burned out, because it's terrible seeing a young reporter burn out, because they come in with so many ideas, and it's really on us as newsroom leaders to make sure that we nurture them, so we don't lose them before they can do even greater things. So that's a long-winded way of saying general operating funds are great and always appreciated.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the question is, how can we give you the most resources possible, and what do you need? So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Mamita, to close us up. And thank you so much, Vandana and Seamus, for sharing the insight and depth of your work with everyone.
That's a loaded question to end on. We definitely have a lot more in the waiting room, so please keep them coming. Feel free to share them with Roshni, and I can circulate it with our panelists today and with Susanna and our research team here at INN, because these are all really wonderful questions, and I'm sorry that, this hour kind of flew by, but that's a good problem to have. I just want to give a heartfelt thanks again to Seamus, Vandana, and Alicia for all of their help and their insights here today. And our sponsors here, Inasmuch, Joyce, and the Pivot Fund, and of course, MIF, because this really would not be possible without all of us being here in this space together to have this discussion. So we're really grateful to have started all of this off. Please keep the questions coming. We will be sending out a few links and resources along with this recording. So I hope that you will take advantage of that and keep the conversation going. And we'll, of course, include links to Seamus and Vandana's work. So if you want to explore their reporting, please do so. And with that, I will pass off to Roshni.
You said it all. You said it all. Alicia, Vandana, Seamus, Susanna, and Momita, thanks for your time, your leadership, and your partnership. We're delighted that we were able to host this session with all of you. And to all of you who joined, thank you for being with us in this space. We've recorded this session, just like Momita mentioned, and we're going to share it with all the registrants and the broader community in the next few days. We host meetings like this all the time, so be sure to check our website for upcoming sessions. And we look forward to more of this soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.